Ready?
Yeah.
Observation 1, resolution analysis. The resolution is that in the case of Ukraine, the European Union should value diplomacy over security. Second, we think that we should be looking at net benefits, basically some sort of utilitarian calculus. We think A, this is because of the word should in the resolution, and B, that it's only practical to assume governments use a utilitarian framework because that's what they actually do right now, and practical considerations mean that it's the only way a policymaker can actually evaluate the impacts and harms of something. Third, we think that the terms are contextualized by the resolution, and fourth, that is our plan. At the European brokered gas negotiations, the European Union will encourage Ukraine to agree to the gas deal advocated by Russia. Okay, I'll get to you at the end.
Can I copy?
Oh yeah, sure. Can you write down a copy?
We'll turn it off.
Okay, cool. Background. First, gas has been promised by Russia's largest gas company. They basically promised all of gas to Ukraine. They basically cut gas to Ukraine over the conflict right now this summer. And second, Ukraine tried to securitize its gas industry by giving subsidies to other gas sponsors, but it's still causing a real problem. Solvency. First, the gas deal leads to Ukraine paying back its $3.1 billion it owes to Russia. We also say that the gas promise will ensure $5 billion cubic meters of gas, which is a really significant amount if you're familiar with the amount of gas quantities. Advantage one is the economy. Uniqueness first, the European Union, the European economy, is on the brink. The little A under here is that there's been very little action from the European Central Bank, and they're really low in legitimacy. The C point is that Greece and Portugal are really struggling with their economic issues right now. They've really decreased, the amount, their GDP has decreased, and they're really struggling. The C point is that Chancellor Angela Merkel pushed for a deal to avoid a repeat of the 2009 crisis. In 2009, Russia cut the gas, and essentially what happened was horrible things where people died because people were frozen to death in their homes in Europe because gas prices rose. Second, it's also key for the European economy. The little A under here is that the Ukraine gas halting is in the status quo, and Hungary has stopped exporting to them because of the lack of supply. Hungary also has a low gas supply, so they've stopped exporting it to Ukraine, which means that prices in Ukraine are incredibly high because of the conflict, because of its internal conflict, and also sponsored a little bit by Russia. And gas is key to the production of many industries. Links. I'll get you at the end of the advantage. Specifically, we guarantee gas by following up with these negotiations. If these negotiations do in fact go through, we think that will be it is a very high propensity because they're meeting within the week of actually getting the gas that's necessary and putting the gas back on, essentially. The impacts are a lot. Look, Ukraine has its gas cut right now, and there's a lot of economic poverty, and there's no heating. And we think that the fact that there's little gas in all of Europe, because essentially Ukraine is the gateway of gas to the rest of Europe, and the gas prices in Europe are increasing. This results in a collapse of Portugal and Greece and other countries because they can't afford to. The common person can't afford to actually pay for the gas for the gas, and this really impacts poverty, and it's really horrible. The second is economic collapse. We specifically isolate the fact that if gas is not turned back on, this would be really problematic. We think that countries going down, prices increasing mean that higher cost of living, and the GDP will go down because there's so much infrastructure is dependent on gas, transportation, exports of goods dependent on gas. If there's a higher cost of gas, that means that basically Europe can't function the way it is right now. So we think that a European economic collapse is very probable with incredibly high gas prices that are caused by the Ukraine shutdown of the Ukraine gas line. Advantage two is basically the problems with security. Right now, the A is the uniqueness first. The status quo is currently securitizing within the EU, Ukraine, and Europe. Specifically, the little A is that Russia has been sending for quite a few weeks now mercenaries to support the rebels. So it's increasing the securitization of Ukraine, specifically the area in East Ukraine. The little B is that there's discussions in the EU right now to sponsor troops to ensure security of Ukraine. Basically what they're doing is they're securitizing exactly what the negative will come and say is good. And C, because basically the resolution is that they should securitize. This little C is that the President of the European Council literally said a few days ago that it's time to get serious about Russia because Russia does not respond to diplomacy. And so basically what the implication is that they're looking for some sort of security, military focus. The B is the solvency. We're specifically, we think that specifically endorsing securitization is what the negative advocacy has to do in order to win the round, and that this actually, and the plan does in fact solve it, because we say that we should be endorsing diplomacy. So it's very clear that they are endorsing securitization. C are the impacts. We think that securitization leads to war. The little I under this is specifically that the momentum. Basically, if you securitize, if you put more troops on the border, if you increase the amount of troops that are present, that makes war more likely. We've seen this so many times, whether it was the breakout of World War I, but essentially, you putting a lot of troops together, even if there could be an accident or just the presence scares people into actually acting. The second argument is the military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex will probably also, if there's a chance of war, will push for it. If there's more troops on the border, then they find it more likely to push like their vested interests in order to actually create war. Third, we say that this creates a no value to life because under a reign of securitization, we really fear for our lives and we don't feel like we can actually communicate, and we're afraid of this inevitable war between Ukraine and Russia and pulling in the EU, and we think that this is really horrible because it creates a cycle, like a complete environment of fear and pain, and we think that this is really problematic. So we think that giving people the idea that they're not going to die tomorrow is a good thing, because then we can live our lives the way we normally do and have some sort of value to life. Kevin, do you have any questions? Or, there's not questions, sorry.
Make the argument that security is only a self-fulfilling prophecy in terms of creating wars.
Exactly. So basically, we think that we isolate many instances in history where securitization was actually the problem, actually caused the war. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you say, oh, we're going to go to war, this is why we have to increase more troops, we think that that increases the likelihood of going to war because it's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Then advantage 1 and advantage 2. Sound good? Everybody ready? The first off case position is that the trichotomy. A is the interpretation. In parliamentary debate, there are 3 different types of resolution. Those of policy, which is that of advocating for the government to do a policy action, that of fact, that we are proving one thing or another, and that of value. That we should have a juxtaposition between 2 different forms of philosophies or ideologies or values that we should prefer one or the other. Which means the second is that this is a value debate. You can look to the resolution that says, in the case of Ukraine, the European Union should value diplomacy over security. This seems to indicate that this is a value resolution because of the fact that it says one is preferable over another, and that we must prioritize one over another. This means B is the violation of the plan is advocating for a plan text or a policy resolution, which we say is not conducive with this resolution in this specific type of debate, which is necessary in parliamentary debate. Which means here are the statements. First is that we believe that having resolutions of value, having discussions of value are a good thing, and that should be prioritized. The first point is that this is the most real world. Is that on an individual basis, we often don't talk about the different political ramifications, but often we have to make, in our day-to-day lives, discussions of which one do we value more, one over the other. Do we value having fun toys, or do we value having good savings? We say that these forms of juxtapositions and saying we value one over the other is more real world. And thus you should prefer a value resolution. But second, we say that this is necessary for limits. Because of the fact that under a policy resolution, evaluating through a policy discussion, specifically in this resolution, allows the affirmative to advocate for all sorts of different things. They could have argued not just this plan, their advocacy, but they also could have argued for, let's say, sanctioning of Russia, or doing any other kind of thing that may have made Russia happy. And yet, there's no way for us to be able to either only to predict what they would have done, but there's no other way we could prepare against that in prep time. Which means that we are left only with these generic discussions of valuing security over diplomacy. Which means that what we are asking you to do through this position is to say that the way that they have approached this debate was incorrect. warrant, and that thus you should be rejecting them for reasons of fairness in education. First, which is the voting issues here. First is that you should evaluate education because of the fact that value resolutions provide a unique form of education that should be prioritized, and that simply ignoring these and advocating for a policy that we have so many other times is just unnecessary, and that you should be prioritizing education through the ballot. But additionally, second, say this is key for competitive equity, that when they can spend the entirety of their 20 minutes looking for a specific policy action that they get to advocate for, and we are simply left with these generic and abstract discussions of value, and then we say that there is an inherent unequalness that occurs through the debate, and thus we say that you should be evaluating this, and you should be voting negative based on this. Moving on to case insolvency discussion. So you can look specifically to the plain text that says that the EU should push Ukraine in order to do this action. However, they never actually get to claim that Ukraine will agree to this. They don't provide any warrants as to why Ukraine would necessarily agree to this action. We have actually a couple of reasons as to why Ukraine would say no. The first argument here is you can look at the fact that Ukraine is in a state of crisis right now, that Ukraine is very hypersensitive to anything that Russia is doing, that you can look at the fact that, and specifically anything that could hurt them into the future, which means there's no reason as to why they're going to listen to the European Union in terms of this gas deal. There's no reason they would necessarily reject this because of the fact that they're afraid of Russia right now. They don't want to encourage this cooperation because they're afraid of losing land and of territory and of their national security, which means that they would reject this. Additionally, second, you can look to specific quotes from individuals within the Ukrainian government. You can look to the Ukrainian Prime Minister said that after attempted negotiations, that Russia wants to freeze us to death. This indicates that the Ukrainian government is completely anti-Russia and they would not agree to this gas deal, which means that the entirety of their advantages, and as to why, I'll take your question at the bottom, indicates that there's that these things that they talk about would never be able to happen because Ukraine isn't going to listen to the European Union. I'll take your question.
Yeah, when was that quote you're talking about?
It was, Jacob, yeah, you wrote it down.
Yeah, that was September 17th.
September 17th, so about 10 days ago. So moving on to, so all of these arguments indicate that there's no solvency for the affirmative. They can't make any legitimate claim for this gas deal actually happening, which is where the entirety of all of their argumentation comes from. But let's look to their advantage on the economy. Looking specifically to the uniqueness debate, they say that the European economy, that the EU economy is on the brink. However, our argument is that the European economy is already so far gone that there's not going to be any saving of it. You can look at the specific statistics that as of last week, the German GDP has all of these indicators are of the GDP decreasing, but in Germany the GDP decreased by 0.6%, which is very concerning considering it's one of the largest economies within the European Union and has been funneling most of the money to other countries. Let's go with that. Additionally, you can look to France, and it has been stagnating recently, in that they've had a 0.1% decrease in their GDP, and that Italy especially has taken significant hits and with a 0.8% decrease in their GDP. All of these are indicators that the economy is so far gone that even this natural gas deal would necessarily not be able to do anything. Additionally, you can look to that the unemployment is so high within the European Union, there's no way that this would be able to solve. You can look to the fact that overall, the unemployment rate is 11.5%, which is very high and has been causing significant harms in the economy, and it's actually significantly higher in specific countries such as Greece, where it's at 27%, and in Spain, where it's at 25%. All of these indicate that the European economy is so far gone that the plan is not going to be able to do anything. But specifically, you can look to the fact that this is only going to make things worse. You can look to the fact that the plan would likely make it more likely for Russia to cut off gas into the future. That this allows for Russia to view the pipeline as something that can be utilized as a political tool. So thus, if you embolden Russia in this way and you allow for them to say this is a tool that we can use, it's more likely for gas to be cut off into the future. Yes, gas is cut off now, but Russia needs access to the revenues that come from it, which means it's not going to stay off forever. This deal is not key. Additionally, you can look to the next argument that in order to pay for this, Ukraine would likely have to cut a lot of its government spending in order to pay for it. That they would likely have to enact things like austerity measures in order to be able to pay for this gas deal. It's a multi-billion-dollar gas deal that's much favoring Russia, which means that Ukraine, while it gets some natural gas, in order to pay for that natural gas, it would necessarily cost the government billions of dollars. It would cost a lot in their social services, which which means that it's overall worse for Ukraine's economy, and thus be more harmful to those individuals in poverty that they claim to solve. But looking to Neg 2, they make some arguments about securitization and how we need to have some form of diplomacy, but diplomacy with Russia has failed. It has always failed. First, you can point to the fact that Russia has been expanding its domestic weaponry market, and that they've invested several hundreds of billions of dollars in expanding their weaponry. This indicates that Russia is not interested in diplomacy; it's more interested in expanding its territory and claiming things like Crimea. But additionally, you can look at the fact that in the past, only force has made any dent within Russian relations. That in 2008, when Russia invaded Georgia, it was only the threat of the United States response that actually caused Russia to back off. This indicates that diplomacy is not an effective tool, and that only acting through force is able to resolve these questions.
All right. The order of this debate, the MG, is going to be first on the trichotomy shell, then down case in the same order. Is everyone ready?
You asked for this back?
I'm actually good. Is everyone ready?
Yes.
First problem for trichotomy shell is that we meet your interpretation. We never said that we were going to be policy. We merely justified that an individual in the government should be valuing the round through net benefits. This means that even if you look to value, we're specifically saying that the way in which you actually compare these values is through net benefits, a utilitarian lens my partner brought up. Specifically, he made the argument on his B subpoint that particular government actors use utilitarianism as the only way in which they can actually make policy actions, which means that this is specifically the value that we're proposing for this round in the first place. So that means we're meeting your interpretation in the first place. Second is the counter-interpretation. Even if you don't believe that we meet your interpretation, our counter-interpretation is that the affirmative may read a policy plan in this debate. Basically, then let's go on to the standards debate specifically. You make the argument that the trichotomy having value is more good for having a more discussion. First of all, against this argument, as a general overview of this entirety of the shell, is that there's no proven abuse in any of this case. They never proved any arguments that they wanted to read in this debate that they couldn't have actually read. At this point, there's no proven abuse or ground that's lost from their side of this debate, which means that there's no way you can vote on this shell. But additionally, they say that having a value discussion is necessarily going to be good. First of all, additionally, we allow this value discussion. When we make the argument that policymakers should be utilitarian makers, they could have contradicted that claim and used a different ethical theory or value claim as to how policymakers should have acted in the first place, which means we could have had that ethical discussion. It's something that they chose to do, not us choosing to do. Furthermore, my articulation is that policy is actually going to be the best way to have a good discussion in this debate, because we can actually look at the issues that are being discussed in the status quo as to why different individuals might consider one situation or the other. They make articulations how us as individuals necessarily have to do things like value good things or good toys, but I'm saying that us as individuals are also participating in the political sphere. We're probably going to be voting for the midterm elections for senators, and those decisions are going to be based on how those senators are reacting towards these different crises that are happening in the international realm, and how those senators are actually doing things to benefit us, which means that the way in which those senators act and the way that those policies actually happen is uniquely important to the way in which our actual education is paramount in this debate. Their next argument is necessary for limits because policy discussion means that the affirmative can advocate for all sorts of things. But first of all, they could have asked questions about what we would have defended. We would have perfectly been happy with them defending any sort of action that they have to do that promotes some sort of security mindset in the first place that allows them to defend the negative side of this resolution. The fact that they didn't do so is only their fault by not asking the question of whether or not we would defend these actions, and also they never read such an action that they are proving that we are delinking them from, which means there's no proven abuses happening on this debate. They say the value of education. We're saying we're actually upholding education even more than them because we allow this real-world education to happen in terms of how we actually interrogate with these policies that are happening that are important to these rounds. Additionally, I would say always evaluate the shell with the lens of reasonability, because that is the only way in which you can actually minimize the ability for them to use this theory as a race to the bottom or as a tool to oppress like our position by excluding the entire of our position. If they say that we're excluding possible negatives, this shell itself excludes the possibility of our entire affirmative from existing in the first place. Probably a reason as to why that they're only biting their own logic there. On case. Let's go to the solvency stuff. They say that Ukraine is going to be saying no to this deal, and they give a couple analyses. The first analysis is that there's state crisis right now, which is like the Ukraine being hypersensitive but that they won't listen to what the European Union has to say. But this is simply false. You can look at the fact that Ukraine isn't listening to the EU has to say. They have two options, either to diplomatically engage in negotiations with Russia or to have negotiations with the European Union. If the European Union, their only other possible ally, is encouraging them to engage with Russia, this probably is the only thing they can listen to because they have no one else to turn to in the first place. Additionally, the fact that their economy is such crisis right now probably means they need to listen to whatever allies they have. Furthermore, all of the analysis on the advantage about how this is so key to their economy is probably additional reasons as to why they will accept this as the EU's blessing for them to negotiate with Russia. Their next articulation is that the Ukrainian government said that they don't, after negotiations that Russia wants to freeze them. They said this on September 17th, but our analysis coming specifically from yesterday when the specific news reports came out that there's going to be a deal that's going to be discussed and signed in the coming next week, which means that this is specifically a deal that is a news analysis coming after their analysis. In addition, if Russia was going to freeze them in the first place, Russia freezing them is what's happening in status quo right now. Signing this deal with Russia is the only way to not get frozen by Russia. That doesn't make any sense. On advantage one economy. You make a bunch of reasons as to why there's different parts of the EU economy that are decreasing the status quo. But first of all, this is only uniqueness against yourself. This is only a reason as to why the world of the negative, in which you have a securitization mindset when you do not engage in this diplomacy, is going to inevitably lead to the European Union collapse, which means it is only It's literally going to be the debate term try or die here for the affirmative to create some sort of change in order to fix this. Furthermore, the GDP losses they're talking about that are happening over the past few months, the 0.6% decrease in German GDP, has all happened since Russia cut off its gas. We're saying that specifically Russia cutting off the gas that's happening in status quo right now is the reason why all the GDPs are falling, which means if that deal is going through and these gases come back, then all the manufacturing and the shipping industries that are reliant on this gas in individual homes for people are going to be able to have massive recoveries because of the fact they're able to get this gas back, which is the key ability for us to solve with this deal itself. They make the argument that the plan is going to mean it's more likely for Russia to use this gas as a tool in the first place. But then they make the argument that Russia needs this revenue. First of all, they're only contradicting themselves. If Russia needs the revenue from the gas, that's probably the reason why they're not going to be cutting it off in the future. But that probably is wrong. Our analysis here is that Russia has cut off the gas right now, which means it's already using it as a tool. In their world of the negative, Russia's already using gas as a tool. It is only possible in the world of the affirmative for us to try to solve the gas crisis by actually negotiating with Russia for them to do this in the first place. Furthermore, this is not just a Russia-focused deal. This is paying back the $3.1 billion of gas revenues that Ukraine already owes to Russia as a debt right now. This is a debt that Ukraine has to Russia that they have not paid back, which is one of the reasons why Russia cut off the gas in the first place. We're simply repaying a debt that already exists. This is not some crazy deal. For these reasons, this is why it's extraordinarily important that us fixing the gas economy in Ukraine is necessarily going to be key in terms of the European economy as a whole, as well as Ukraine's economy. You can look at the fact that these specific decreases in gas is what's hurting the economy because the shipping and manufacturing industries that rely on this massive amount of gas in order to operate properly are simply not able to be fully sustained, which is why you're seeing the GDP losses that they're specifically talking about, which means that we're the only ones that have a chance of solving for the GDP. We stop people from freezing to death because people don't have gas. We also stop the propensity for this economy to tumble into the abyss that's happening in the negative world. On the advantage of security. The only arguments that the negative is making against the security advantage is about how Russia is using more military equipment than status quo, and the fact that when they invaded, when they invaded Georgia, that's like the only way they were able to push back was because of U.S. threats. That's simply not true. If you actually open a history book, you would know the reason they did not successfully engage in Georgia was because of rebel groups and different terrorist groups. You can look to similar things that happened with Chechnya, where these different terrorist groups were able to force out Russia because it was becoming way too costly for Russia to actually engage in these military measures. This is simply not true. You're simply empirically denied. Additionally, you're not answering the bulk of this advantage. You're completely conceding it. The premise of this advantage is just to say that the securitization mindset that the negative is inherently advocating for and negating resolution is inherently flawed, because the securitization mindset that we need to always securitize against Russia is what allows for us to always cast Russia as the enemy, which forces Russia to cast Ukraine and other countries like the European Union as the enemy in the first place. This idea that we always need to consider them as a enemy to securitize against instead of a different diplomatic actor which we can engage in economic diplomacy with is always we're going to say is the root cause of us having to go to war with them in the first place. The reason why Russia is feeling the need to make these military advances is because it sees these people as enemies rather than economic partners in which it can invest with and sustain its own economy, which we're saying is always going to mean that we're able to stop wars as well.
I can go in the same order.
You can extend my opponent's counterinterpretation that the affirmative may read a policy option in this context. This is going to be pretty important for the rest of the round though, particularly when we get to Advantage 2, where all of their links from Advantage 2 are about the security mindset that we create. When we step into a policy world, as my opponents wish us to do based on the fact that they read a plan, they need us to read a counterplan before they can claim that we've created a mindset. Reading that we create a security mindset out of their first speech before we've even spoken really doesn't make any sense, but we're going to talk about that a lot more when we get to that sheet. However, that's the important thing that we need to take out of this trichotomy, is that when they're reading a policy, that means that we get to have a policy debate. So it's going on to the solvency arguments. This is where we say that the Ukraine would not agree. The first thing that they say is that the Ukraine only has two options: to diplomatically engage with Russia or with the European Union. Only under their plan, though, is the Ukraine forced to diplomatically agree with Russia right now. You can extend all of Corey's arguments about how the Ukraine is in a crisis right now and they're afraid of what Russia will do to them, of loss of land, specifically in the Crimea region, to Russia, that Russia is going to come in and take a portion of their land, particularly the portion of their land that generates a large amount of the wealth that exists in Ukraine. The reason that Russia wants the Crimea region is because it is resource rich. That is why there is a dispute happening right there. And as a result, if the EU, which is my opponent's policy option, forces or urges the Ukraine to work with Russia, then the propensity for the Ukraine to lose this portion of their land is very high. That means that the Ukraine is likely to lose a large amount of their political autonomy within the region. This is a direct result of my opponent's policy option. The alternative, not having the EU encourage the Ukraine to agree with Russia, would not cause this to happen. But the next argument that I want us to look to is not on the solvency. Corey, are you happy on the solvency?
Yes.
Cool. On to Advantage 1. On Advantage 1, there are a couple of important arguments that I think we need to look to. First, you can look to Corey's first link term argument. That is that it is highly likely that Russia is going to cut off gas in the future if we force Ukraine to agree to this gas deal. Because what they will have learned is that cutting off natural gas supplies is an effective negotiating tactic that not only is capable of manipulating the Ukraine, but also the European Union as a whole. You can extend my opponent's argumentation about how this is particularly important to their ability to heat themselves. So while Russia may agree to send natural gas into the Ukraine right now so that they can warm themselves over the winter, that doesn't mean that Russia isn't going to do this in future winters. There is a very high propensity, if we teach Russia that this is an effective negotiating tactic, that they are going to reuse it. This is the only form of negotiation that they have been effective in. There have been sanctions placed against Russia, there have been diplomatic talks that have happened with Russia, but only cutting off the natural gas supply has been able to cause the change that Russia wishes to see in the world. Giving into them right now is only going to teach them that this is their best way to get what they wish from the rest of Europe. That means that we are more likely to see this tactic used against Europe as a whole, rather than just in the context of the Ukraine. If there is ever a point where the EU and Russia have opposing interests, or there is serious conflict between them, then we are likely to see the problems that we're seeing right now in the Ukraine across all of Europe, which is going to spark considerably larger problems than what we have right now. So our best bet is to leave these problems in the Ukraine rather than blowing them up and spreading them across all of Europe. If we put the entire European Union in natural gas scarcity, all of the impact scenarios that my opponents described that happen as a result of natural gas scarcity, that of a collapse of industry, that of individuals not having access to personal heating and freezing to death in their homes, only happens in 20 times the number of countries. It just means that these impacts are expanded to encompass 1 billion more people than it otherwise would have, rather than the number of individuals in Ukraine right now. Which is why you are going to be voting on this argument as a means to protect the rest of Europe from falling subject to Russia exercising this tactic in the future. But the next argument that you can look to is the one that they don't respond to, which is Corey's argument that in order to meet these goals, the Ukraine would have to enact serious austerity measures. That means that they need to cancel all of their social services that would otherwise be providing for impoverished individuals who have already lost their jobs as a result of the fighting that is happening in the Ukraine right now. Cutting social services right now, right as we lead into winter, means that these individuals will necessarily be freezing and starving to death. Only by the EU encouraging the Ukraine to take this? Is this possible? At present, the Ukraine is economically able to provide for its citizens as a result of the support that is coming in from the EU. But if we cut off that EU support as a means of telling the Ukraine that they need to comply with Russia, which is what my opponent's advocacy is through their policy, the only hope that the Ukraine has is to so severely cut their programs that the poor are destined to die right now. That is not happening in the status quo. There are protections that are being sent in from other European nations. However, if the European nations as a whole abandon the Ukraine, we will inevitably see a die-off of the lowest classes in the Ukraine, which is something that we must avoid at all costs. If we can distribute the harms across the entire population of the Ukraine, that is preferable to sending the harms concentrated to one smaller population.
And there are other ways to get gas. The U.S. has huge...
Right, there are other ways that the Ukraine has access to natural gas. It can be sent from the European Union. It can be sent from the United States. The United States is one of the largest growing natural gas producers in the world right now as a result of our increased use of fracking in the Midwest. But moreover, you can look to Canada, who is one of the larger natural gas producers in the world, through the higher regions in the Arctic, where they are able to extract large amounts of natural gas and distribute those readily throughout the world. The shipping infrastructure already exists. These individuals can be protected. The only way that we can guarantee that more people are going to be dying in the Ukraine right now is if we force Ukraine to cut all of its government programs so that it can afford to pay this unreasonable gas deal to Russia that Russia has offered up. Of course, when Russia comes to the negotiating table, they're going to provide something that will provide them with outrageous profit and significantly harm the Ukraine, who they are already at war with. It's in their best interest. There's no reason why we should force the Ukraine to accept the deal that their attacker is providing right now. That's completely out of the question. But now, on to the second advantage about security. There are a couple of arguments that I think are going to be pretty critical here. The point at which my opponents wish us to shift to a policy debate, which is what they said on that trichotomy sheet. They want us to be in a policy debate. Then they don't have any links that explain how we're creating the securitizing mindset. I haven't said anything about sending the military out to respond to this. What I'm saying is that diplomacy fails, and that the EU should not seek diplomacy with Russia in this instance. Because that is the framework that my opponents have created, they don't get access to making the arguments that they wish to make. That only would have worked under a value debate, but at the point at which they have abandoned the value debate, yeah, I'll take your question.
Are you defending the status quo?
Yes.
Okay.
At the point at which my partner and I are defending the status quo and we don't have a competing policy option, they don't get access to attaching this to the negative team. But moreover, I wanted to urge that it is critically important that my opponents not be allowed to attach new disadvantages to the status quo, considering that there are no new speeches or opportunities to respond. The PMR is not going to be allowed new access to this. They set the rules from the PMC and clarified them out of the member of government. They don't get new access now.
I'm going to just discuss voting issues and try to put the ground in context. Alright? Sounds good. There are three arguments that the affirmative has to win in order for you to give the ballot to Berkeley. The first argument they need to win is that Ukraine will agree to the gas deal. The function of having a plan text means that they have to prove not only that it's solvent, but that it will happen and that there will be good effects of it. If they cannot prove that Ukraine will agree to the gas deal, then they do not give them this ballot. The second argument that they have to win is that the gas deal will have good effects. That will help the people of the Ukraine, and that will decrease poverty. We will be winning arguments about how the overall effects, not only in the future of the usage of Russia's usage of this as a political tool, but also that the effects of this gas deal especially are going to be substantially worse for the Ukrainian citizens. It means that you will not be giving Berkeley the ballot there. The last argument that can win in the debate is this argumentation about securitization. I keep saying these words. They never really contextualize it. The only thing they get to argue is that we create some sort of security mindset. Not only do we not, we prove substantially that the actions of diplomacy are not effective, that the functioning in this way does not work, which means that you will not be voting for Berkeley there, which means that you will be casting your ballot for the University of Nevada Reno. But looking to some of the specific arguments. They need to win. The first argument they need to win is that the Ukraine will agree. They try to come up here and say that all of this is key for Ukraine to have gas and it's key for their economy. we should be looking to check the analysis, not only that this isn't key because they can get gas from other places, such as the United States, Canada, the European Union, all these different places, but additionally that there's just no justification for why Ukraine is going to agree to a major gas deal that is beneficial to Russia, and Russia is the one attacking them. We give you several warrants, not only about how Ukraine is hypersensitive because of the fact that Russia has attacked them, stolen their land, and challenged Ukraine's national security, which means all of these things are much more important than the gas that they lost. But also, there are very individuals in the government, and all these indicators have shown that Ukraine is not going to agree. This means that the plain text is not possible and will not happen. We do not allow them to come up in the next speech and make some kind of argument about how they're going to listen. They have not substantially proven this. Additionally, the second issue that we talked about is that they have to prove that this will be good for the economy. I want you to look at the fact that the arguments they are making are those that Ukraine needs the gas and that will have the gas and that it has to have it into the future. I want you to look to our analysis that says that Russia is trying to use this as a negotiating tool, as a political tool in order to gain not only power but also to gain land. This means that when Ukraine is not engaged with them, it tells Russia this is not a tool that they can use and they won't use it in the future. Having the European Union tell Ukraine, you have to do this now in order to get the gas, means Russia's going to use it in the future. If it's an effective political tool, if it's an effective negotiating tool, they'll use it. They will use it into the future, which not only makes it worse for those individuals in the Ukraine, but also is worse for the entirety of the European Union. Because now Russia is going to use the different natural gas pipelines as a tool for anything the European Union does, which means that this is going to be worse overall. It's going to affect substantially more people. They're going to try to come up in their last speech and argue that individuals are being hurt by the fact that they don't have heating and that they don't have power. This will be substantially worse if Russia thinks they can use this as a negotiator. But additionally, even if they do agree to the pipeline deal, you look to the conceded argumentation, which means the PMR doesn't get to respond, that in order to pay for this, Ukraine would have to enact austerity programs that would cut social services, that would be worse for those individuals, and thus you should be voting for the University of Nevada.
Sorry. So I'm going to start on advantage 2. Ready? I'm pretty sure in Lincoln-Douglas debate, if you drop a contention, that means you pretty much, if your opponent drops a contention, you pretty much win the round. I think that we're not talking, this is a completely policy app, they're completely right. But our uniqueness is specifically why, right now, the status quo is securitizing. Our argument here is that, my argument here is that right now the status quo is securitizing. The plan solves this by being diplomatic, and they've conceded the impacts of securitization. They've dropped all their arguments against this. They think because they dropped the theory shell, which I think was pretty abusive, them just running a theory shell and then dropping it. They think that just because they conceded to our interpretation, that means they get to forget about advantage 2. They've completely dropped advantage 2, which means we win the round. We are telling you that the status quo is securitizing, specifically that the EU, the president of the EU specifically said it's time to get serious, and that Russia doesn't respond to diplomacy, which means, doesn't respond to diplomacy, and we need to securitize, which is evidence that right now the status quo is securitization. Our solvency is specifically that endorsing diplomacy is good because our plan endorses diplomacy. Our impact is that this prevents the impacts of securitization, like the inevitable war. These impacts have been conceded throughout the whole speech. They are true. Securitization is bad. They've conceded that. They've also conceded that the status quo is securitization and that we solve for the securitization. That is the only thing you should be looking at when you evaluate this round. This was just a mistake on their part, and this is how you evaluate the round.
Can you weigh it out?
Okay, yeah. Second, war is really bad. I don't think I should be having to tell you this, but war is really bad and it outweighs it. And no one else is doing any weighing in this debate. We are outweighing because war we can get pulled into a WMD war. There's a large propensity for something really bad to happen where nuclear weapons are involved and a lot of people die. This is a really bad thing, and we think that since there's 100% solvency, we have 100% probability of it happening without the plan, that you should be giving us a lot of leverage on this part of the debate. So we win simply on this. If you do not buy that, I think that the other question you need to be asking yourself is, where is the offense? As an LD debater, you should know you need offense and you need offense. You can have as much defense as you want, but you need offense. Why is securitization good? Why, if they're providing you with these answers, then maybe you should vote for them. But I really don't see them on the flow, and neither should you. So let's go to advantage one. We're going to say that specifically that advantage one isn't as important as advantage two, but I think that they're conceding a few arguments. They're already conceding that right now the status quo is really, really bad. Look at the GDPs of all. They brought up the GDPs. We didn't even have to bring up the GDPs of Germany and France and how unemployment is really high in the EU, which means that the status quo is undesirable and that anything is better than nothing. They make a few arguments. They have two turns essentially. They say that this is just teaching that Russia that they can play, but this cut the gas and get whatever we want. However, Kevin's response is completely conceded that they've already done this. This isn't like the first time they've done it. So if Russia already knows how to work, they did it in 2009. There's no reason, whatever they're talking about, us setting precedent really doesn't matter. And even if you don't buy that, people are freezing to death right now. I think that the EU's ego about, oh, we have to concede to Russia's demands is not really important right now. The people who are freezing to death because they don't have gas enough to warm their homes are more important than the EU's ego right now. Yes?
They say that this is key because it's going to stop the Russian cutting off gas to all other countries. That's false. Gas to all countries is cut off because the gas is a pipeline that goes through Ukraine right now.
Exactly. So, right, they're making a lot of arguments, oh, the US can give them gas. However, that's not really how gas works. Gas works by pipelines. It's a lot more expensive to ship gas, which means that you're just increasing the amount of the price for gas, which means that it's even more expensive to warm your home and prevent yourself from dying. Even if you don't buy that, I would say that if you start trying to import gas from everywhere else, that means that you're just creating a global economic collapse because you're raising the prices for everyone because more gas is coming to Europe. There's a zero-sum game when it comes to gas. You can't just the gas in the U.S. prices would increase because Europe is taking more, which means that you're just increasing the price of gas, which means you're causing a whole global economic meltdown. This outweighs any of the arguments that they're talking about. Next, they talk about austerity. However, this has been empirically denied because of the 2009 example. This is the way you evaluate the right. Yeah.
You get on solvency. They say that Ukraine's going to say no. Can you answer?
Oh yeah. So Ukraine says no. That's one, defensive, so it doesn't matter because we have a risk of a link. But two, that's not true because we conceded that all the sponsors, everyone in the EU wants Ukraine to do it. They have no choice at all to do it. They're dying.
I felt like it was a little bit weird that only one of you stood up while you spoke. I'm just used to that. But that's fine, I guess if that's what you do. I also understand it's like kind of typical, I don't know if for a parley debate, but like for other kinds of debate that you speak really fast. It was kind of hard to follow everything that you were saying. So maybe it was a speaking fast, but I just really didn't feel like you set up a really good argument from the beginning. Like I just maybe couldn't follow it, but it didn't seem very, I don't know, put together or something. So the negative point that you're kind of framing the debate wrong kind of did it for me. So I felt like it was kind of set up in a weird way, and the stuff about the securitization like was not contextualized. Like, I didn't really understand what you were trying to say about that. So the negative point that so your point that they conceded that is just, I don't know, I guess it was kind of difficult for both of us, for all of us to understand exactly what was going on there. So that's my opinion.
Thank you.
Did you feel me?